So this is Unit 4, Module 1, Lesson 4, Returns. There's a fast start activity. Once you get started on the fast start activity, and pause the video. So today's lesson is about returns. You should have downloaded the two startup files that are at the very bottom of the lesson in Blackboard. One is for the practice assignment, and one is for today's class. So what's a return? A return sends information back to the calling method. You can only send one thing, one piece of information. Now, when I say that one piece of information, it could be an object, which really includes a whole lot of information. It's a package of stuff all put together. So when you say return one value, it's not necessarily just like a single number. That could be a whole collection of things, but it must all be packaged together in some way. When we first start, we're going to be sending integers back, we might send a string back, but as we get more sophisticated, we'll be sending full objects back that contain a whole lot more information than just a single number. So here's an example of return. The return command is essentially exactly that. It's the word return. And then you put after it whatever you're going to return from it. Notice we have a different declaration here. In previous declarations of the method, it was public static void. That meant it returned nothing. Now the method declaration here is public static int. That means this method is expected to return an integer. If it doesn't, Java won't compile. So let's talk about that for a second. When I write if A is greater than B, return A, then I write return B, Java's guaranteed to return an integer no matter what. But suppose I forgot to write this line right here where it says return B. Well, if I didn't write that line, Java wouldn't compile because it would say, well, there's a case, there's a possibility that if A is equal to B or A is less than B, I won't get that return statement. I won't reach that return statement, so it's going to cause an error. So down here I have a question. Why is there no else? Why do we not have an else statement here? Why not, if A is greater than B, return A, else return B? So if A is 20 and B is 6, do we achieve this command, return A? Yeah. Do we also achieve this command, return B? Well, that would be problematic if we did, because then we're returning two things. We're returning A, and then we're returning B. That's a problem. I just said methods can't return more than one thing. So the question is, what does Java actually do here? What happens here is the return command doesn't just return a value. It returns control to the calling method. So whatever called this method, now as soon as that return command is executed, gets control back. This method stops. So as soon as we say return A, done. Nothing else in the method is executed. I can have 3,000 lines after this. None of it's executed because I hit return A. It stops the method. When you're writing methods, you can structure your if statements a little bit differently because we didn't need an else statement here. Because the execution of the method stops here when A is greater than B. Now, if A is not greater than B, then all we're going to do is return B. So one of the things you have to do when you're checking out your methods, debugging your methods, is to make sure you're only returning one value, and you are returning a value. It's exactly one value. You must return exactly one value no matter what. And furthermore, it must be of the same type that you declared. We said we're going to return an int, so we have to return an int. No other choice. One thing must be one thing, and it must be what we declared. Let's take a look at the code that is given in the startup file. So we have our public static void main. We have our scanner. We're going to print out some commands for the user to follow. Hopefully they'll follow directions. We're going to get two ints, an x and a y. And we're going to system print out the largest is plus max x comma y. Now every other time we did a method call, the method call sat on a line all by itself. This time the method calls within the print line, because the method call is actually going to return a number. We can print out the method call result. You must do something with a method that returns a value, whether it's to print it or assign that value to some variable. If you were just to say max x comma y on a line by itself, you would cause an error, because something happens there, a number comes back, something has to be handled with that. You can't just ignore that value that's sent back. You have to do something with it. So what we do is we print it out. So we're going to print the max of x and y, much like we did with the math class. Right? When we use absolute value in the math class, we did math.abs -5. And it returned a value to us. It sent a value back and put it on the screen when we printed it out. We did something with it. So we've actually experienced returns before without really necessarily talking about it. All of the math functions that we dealt with are methods with return values. The arguments here, x and y, match up to the parameters a and b, and remember, because they're primitives, they're making a copy of the data. So the values that are in a and b are totally separate from the values that are in x and y. Now, it's not that big of a deal because we don't really do anything to a and b, but it's something you should continuously think about. Always be thinking about the scope. What is the scope of my variables? Where are they contained? What has control of them? What can change them? And if you're always thinking about it, then the idea will become concrete in your head. So here, the scope of x and y is within public static void main. The scope of a and b is just here in this method. There is nothing that links the two. There's no alias that's created because they're primitives. So, return methods must do something to catch the data sent back. Whether it's to print it out, like we did in the last example, or to store it in a variable, you have to catch the data coming. If nobody's there to catch the ball, you get hit in the face. Java doesn't like to get hit in the face, so it throws up at you a whole bunch of red errors. We don't like Java throwing up at us, so we'll put something there to catch the information. So you can either store it in a variable, print it out, or use it in a Boolean condition. So maybe your method return was Boolean. You know, you did public, static, Boolean, whatever. And it was a comparison and it returned either true or false. Very useful way of writing a method. Again, takes all of that information where we set flags. Remember us to go through all the process of setting flags? We could refactor some of that and end up doing it inside of a method and just have it return true or false. Instead of making huge chunks of code that we kind of have to trace back and forth and check for errors. So maybe we write an error checking routine, a method that just checks our tweet, right? Check for 140 characters. And it just returns true or false. Check for asterisks, right, in the other program. Check to see if it has an asterisk, returns true or false. Check to see if it's the correct number of characters, returns true or false. Notice how that takes those really complicated if statements where you had to bracket things off and do multiple conditions or use a flag and makes it a lot simpler, because now you're just doing a single method call. Is the result of both of these method calls true? You could do a combined if, check asterisk, and check characters. So if those are both true, then continue. Have the print out the error message somewhere inside of the loop, inside of the method call, so it prints out the error right inside that method call. And then you could use that anywhere. That'd be nice to be able to check to make sure values are part of a particular character set. That's a nice little method you could write that you could plug into lots of different examples, because users, you always want to control what the user types in, especially nowadays. This is one of the things that comes up in coding websites is something called an injection attack, where someone will send in commands into a prompt in a form, and by creative use of quotation marks, they can put in database SQL commands that will actually change your username and password for your back-end database and give them total control of your entire website. And that's how you see things where the whole site gets hacked and somebody puts up like a clown face or something, ha ha ha, you've been hacked, And then usually I just go in and I delete everything and I put my backup file back up. So it's not a big deal, but it's a pain in the neck for corporations, because then they have somebody who took over their website, and you go to google.com and you see a giant clown face, you're going to be like, wow, that's kind of weird. So here is another example of the way we would call a method using a return. We have a value x that clearly had to be initialized as an int in the very beginning, declared type int x, and maybe set equal to 0. And then we have to store max a and b, the result of that, inside of our integer. So we can essentially write our own math function. So maybe you write one for quadratic formula. That doesn't exist, right? You could write a quadratic formula method that did this for you, and go ahead and do those calculations. You could return imaginary numbers even, right? Maybe it returned it as an array, where the first value in the array was the real part, and the second value in the array was the imaginary part. It'd be pretty straightforward. And it stores the values in a variable x. Again, you'd have to declare x as an int somewhere, because max returns an int. Or, like I said, we can print the answer. Or if we wanted to make it part of a Boolean, we could paste it right in there in the if statement. If z equals equals, and we can use equals equals because it's primitive. It's fine to use equals equals when it's primitive. Max a comma b, so this one uses the command returned in a Boolean command inside an if statement. Or, as I said earlier, that this itself could be a Boolean. If the return value type was Boolean, you would just say if max a comma b. It'd be done. That's it. It would return a true or false. And you wouldn't have to test anything. So let's take a look at this method call. Here's an example where we use our x and y values. The largest is max comma x comma y. What's happening here in memory is Java is running the method max, does the calculation, returns a and b, and then a and b are destroyed. They don't exist anymore. Then we call it again. A and b is recreated. It does its stuff, and then a and b are destroyed again. So every time that method call is created, we build a new a and b, we use them, and as soon as control is returned, we return it back to So if we return it back to the calling method, so as we're done, any variables that were created inside the method are destroyed. So int large is equal to max x comma y. It's all primitives here, so no aliases are created. So the fact that we're incrementing large has got nothing to do with anything. It's just increasing the value by 1. Here's another example. We print it out again. Max is called, and we make that our method call. A and B are created. A and B are destroyed. Then we call it again. Max x comma y. A and B are created. It returns the value. A and B are destroyed. So the basic idea is we send a method data through our parameters in the definition of the method. It comes as an argument. It goes to the parameters. We can have as many parameters as we want. There's no limit on the number of parameters in Java. None. There's a physical limit in terms of memory size of the computer, in terms of the program it can run, but that's really, for all intents and purposes, unlimited now. At this point in modern computing, that's an unlimited number. The method sends data back using a return statement. And when I say data, it's data as a package. Whether it's a single int, it's a string, it's an array object that might contain a whole bunch of information, but it's still packaged. It's some other type of object where the information is all packaged together. You're only allowed to return one thing. And like I said, the method only returns one value. All right, we'll pick up with the rest of this next lesson. In the meantime, why don't you take a look at trying this utry to write a method average that takes 2 double parameters and returns the average. Also, make sure you're finishing up the Pictures Lab activity 5 and 6. You should have everything you need to do those now at this point. See you next lesson. Oh, and always never stop coding.